Great.
Hello, my name is Athman Vakil, and I'm a writer for the Chicago Thinker. I'm a fourth year in the college majoring in economics and music, and today it is my pleasure to interview Spencer Klavan on his new book, How to Save the West: Ancient Wisdom for Five Modern Crises. And a little bit about Spencer. He is a scholar, writer, and podcaster who has a lifelong devotion to the great works and principles of the West. After studying Greek and Latin as an undergraduate at Yale, he spent 5 years at Oxford earning his doctorate in ancient Greek literature. Now an editor at the Claremont Institute, he has written for many outlets, including The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, City Journal, Newsweek, the Claremont Review of Books, the Federalist, the American Mind, and the Daily Wire. He lives near Nashville, Tennessee. Spencer, it's great to have you here. We have known each other for around 3 years now, mostly through Twitter. And just following the Young Heretics podcast, which was your podcast in which you talked a lot about the recurring themes in this book, and seeing them culminate into this book, which I really enjoyed reading, has just been a delight. And thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Aatman. It's really a joy to be with you. I remember seeing I think it was a reaction video to one of the first episodes of Young Heretics. You were one of the first listeners to that podcast that I ever formed a relationship with, engaged with online. And it's just so great to see how you developed as a thinker as well during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm really excited to dig into your new book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it over spring break, and something which really struck out to me is how you're able to connect various disciplines, various issues, and philosophical questions which philosophers and thinkers across centuries have grappled over into this book, and presented it in a very concise manner to people who may not have any background in these cultural, social issues, and used them to generate ideas about how we might deal with society today. So with that, I my first question about this book is, what led you to write it? Why do you think the West needs to be saved? And even more so, what is the West? That is a very abstract question.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll begin with the second part of your question because I think it's great to define what we're talking about. When I told a friend of mine that I was writing a book called How to Save the West, she said, "Oh, that's awesome. I love John Wayne movies." And I said, "Not that West. That's a different thing. It's not a region on the map that I'm talking about. I talk about the West. And it's also not, perhaps importantly, it's not any one specific nation or race of people. I mean, a lot of the accusations that get made about Western culture, Western history, is that it's essentially a kind of byword for chauvinism of some kind or another, racism, superstition, sort of backwards thinking, and all of that. And I was lucky that I learned early on in my life that none of those accusations was true. I mean, when I talk about the West, what I'm talking about is the great tradition of Athens and Jerusalem and the cultural intellectual inheritance that comes down from those two pillars, really, of civilization. By Athens, I mean, the Greek and Roman philosophers of antiquity, and by Jerusalem, I mean the scriptures and the wisdom literature of Judaism and Christianity. And off the bat, already, you can see that there's a kind of a wide range of perspectives and ideas kind of encompassed in that. And yet, at the same time, over the course of history, as these two streams kind of meet in Europe, they do start to form something that is recognizable as a tradition. It's not completely monolithic. It's not a series of points that you have to sign up to join this dogma called the West, but it is something that has formed all of us, whether we know it or not, who live within this tradition, who were born into it or who entered into it, over the course of our lives. We're formed by these profound ideas that don't just drop out of the sky. They have a history. Things like, when in America we say all men are created equal. That's a good example of something that most people throughout time and space have not believed. And it's important to know why we believe it, where that idea comes from, how it was wrought carefully through centuries of debate and discussion. That's the merit of studying the Western canon generally, I think. And then the first part of your question was about this particular moment and why I think this is an important time to write a book called How to Save the West, to bring this kind of classical learning to bear on modern problems, on the news cycle. And really, I think one reason why is contained in that word crisis. And it's a word that we hear all the time. We have a supply chain crisis, we have a crisis in housing, whatever you want to name in the news, we have a crisis of it. And a lot of those things are very serious problems. I'm not diminishing or belittling them, but the Greek word krisis, which comes from a verb, krino, it means a point of choosing, a time for deciding between fundamentally irreconcilable ways of looking at the world. And I think what's happening right now in the West, in those nations and places, and among those people who understand themselves as inheritors of this tradition, is that we're going through a kind of sea change in our technology, especially the way that we relate to one another, the cosmos. I mean, these big fundamental questions are kind of coming up again, things that I deal with in the book, like, is there absolute truth? What's the place of man in the universe? And those are the moments, even though those moments tend to be very unsettling and they seem very new, and a lot of our technology is quite new, those are actually the moments when those fundamental first order questions become more urgent, not less. That's why it pays to go back into the tradition, is they can help you to understand that some of this stuff, some of the things that seem very cutting edge, like cultural relativism, the transgender sort of, I would call it a mania, but this sort of certainly the new uptick in transgender dysphoria. I mean, these things feel very modern, but actually under the surface, what they are is they're crises, they're engagements with these deep, profound fundamental questions. And I thought it was important that people understand we're not alone in facing those questions. We have a whole history behind us that we can bring to bear on those questions, and people should have an inroad to that. They should have a way of gaining access to that company of thinkers.
Yeah, thank you. That does make a lot of sense. Just in talking about what I was mentioning earlier, how you are able to connect crises which mankind has seen beforehand, whether it is, say, the fall of the Roman Empire, or even so the many types, talking about Rome, the many types of government they went through to reach where they were at the height of their dominion. That's one example. Later on, even in Christianity, the way you would see many schisms in the church, many points like 1453, the fall of Constantinople, and that fear that is the West gone at that point. You see a lot of it happening, maybe not through an impending Ottoman conquest today, but through a more internal shift in the way people perceive not only themselves, but their relationships with each other and with society. Um, Going into these crises more deeply, you define five main crises in the book: the reality crisis, the body crisis, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of religion, and regime crisis. Um, for someone who has not read the book, could you give a very short nutshell preview of what these crises are, and if they're related to each other, how they are related?
Absolutely. They're very tightly related. And actually, the book kind of walks through them in what I believe to be the most logical order. I really think one of the great benefits of going back to the wisdom traditions of Athens and Jerusalem is it helps you identify first order questions and to begin at the beginning. And the first order question that I think we're really up against before anything else is, can we talk about such things as absolute truth in the moral realm and in the what you might call the ontological realm? Is it really just a big competition between my truth and your truth and whoever can shout the loudest? Or is there absolute truth that we can progress toward, even if we progress haltingly by half measures? That's the reality crisis. Is there reality? It goes all the way from the metaverse on to our political disputes over fake news and social media. And so I offer in that section some guidance for how to think about absolute truth that comes from Athens, from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The next part of this does then have to do with our place, our particular human place in relationship to those absolute truths. Because if there are absolute truths, then they are eternal and they are beyond any one culture or place or whatever. And what that means is that, we are not eternal. And so suddenly we experience this, you might call it a lack, a longing. We want to know truth. We want to commune with these eternal things, but we are acutely aware that our bodies break down and die. We live in this world of constant change and decay. Heraclitus, the famous sophist, says that all is in flux. And so when we come up against this, it can make us very uncomfortable about the kinds of beings that we are, and even occasion disgust in ourselves. And we want to change our bodies or transcend our bodies or just get away from humanity altogether. And that's why this section of the book is about transhumanism and transgenderism, because I believe that's the latest version of an old problem, which is, what are we supposed to do with our human bodies? And that's the body crisis. And I argue that the best way to understand our bodies is as embodied souls, that we have both spirit and flesh and they are melded together. The next two crises go right hand in hand, and they follow off from this belief that we are embodied souls who can know truth. Is the meaning crisis and the crisis of religion. What is the ultimate meaning or truth toward which we point when we say that something has meaning or that there is absolute truth? Where can we find that? Because I don't think that we can find it in materialism. I don't think we can just find it in the workings of nature and what science teaches us. Science can teach us a lot, but it can't teach us things like what is good, what is morally good. And so the really only place that you can go for that is to metaphysics and to the supernatural world. And so the crisis of religion is, can we believe? Is it possible in a world of science and technology to believe in a God? And I argue that it very much still is. In fact, it's necessary to make sense out of things. And then finally, the crisis of regime, which is the last one, just comes from saying, well, all of these abstract speculations are very nice, but how do we apply them to the here and now when America seems to be falling apart? And that's when I sort of address some of the stuff you were talking about, the history of great nations rising and falling, where we might stand in that, and what our job might be. Because there's a lot of hand waving about everything's falling apart or everything's going to be fine, a lot of predictions about the future. But I really think that the better question is, what is our hope? Where should we place our hope? I argue that we should place it in one another, in neighborly communities, through what the Greeks would have called philia, friendly love, the love of friends, especially in political communities. And that whatever may come, that's our final job is simply to live in the here and now with one another, in political friendship.
Yeah, thank you for that summary. And now maybe we can just go back to each crisis, explore it a bit more.
Hmm.
Um, I want to go back to that first uh, thing you said about cultural and moral relativism, that there is one absolute underlying truth to the world, and the fact that multiple people cannot come up with their own versions of the truth, that would just lead to utter chaos and not allow anyone to pursue their fulfillment of life. Um, you said that this book and the West in general is based on the two poles of Athens and Jerusalem.
Hmm.
These, of course, have many fundamental distinctions and differences in their way of thinking, in their way of approaching the world. Chiefly, if you even talk about Christianity, the Athens pole has no idea about who this guy Jesus Christ is, who's going to come around 300, 400 years later. Um, and throughout history, I've seen thinkers try to grapple with this dichotomy in various different fields. For example, in music, the music theorist from the 16th century, Heinrich Glarian, proposed a new theory of what modality is in music. And in
Mm-hmm.
that, he really strove to reconcile, as a devout Catholic, the church definition of mode to what ancient Greek and Roman writers wrote about mode, because he was also, in addition to being a devout Catholic, a humanist. That's just one example. And through this book, you bring up this dichotomy quite a lot, the way writers and thinkers in antiquity might have, who were staunchly Christian, might have criticized the Greek way of doing things, and how Neoplatonists would think that the way Judeo Christian values approach certain issues in the world are wrong. Could you shed some more light on this dichotomy, how it can be reconciled, if it can be reconciled?
Well, the early church father Tertullian, who was known for his sharp pen, was perhaps the first person to put into stark terms this very antagonism. He wrote, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And this is a famous tag. And it's even then, even in Tertullian's hands, it's a bit tongue in cheek, because Tertullian is very visibly indebted to a whole range of Stoic ideas, which I think also are visible in the Gospel of John. So right from the beginning, it's not so starkly cut and dry as the fiercest polemicists would like you to believe, but there's no question that these are distinct cultures, and that's part of the beauty to me of the Western tradition, is that it does actually incorporate this vast range of, as you said, ways of looking at the world. I think that's a really great way of putting it. I mean, one way that people sometimes describe this, Leo Strauss famously, the great 20th century thinker, famously identified Athens with reason and Jerusalem with revelation. And, again, Strauss would not have wanted to draw that line so harshly, but this idea that, in Athens, you have the world as understood through the human mind at its height, the flowering of logos, of rational thought. And then in Jerusalem, you have the world as illuminated from outside of itself, that this kind of ray of light bursts in on Sinai, or on Zion, or what have you, to show you something that you could never have thought up yourself. And one way that Christians have typically reconciled this kind of opposition is to say, well, if the truths of Revelation are true, then they're going to make sense when you view the world in light of them. And a lot of the things that had seemed sort of true, or maybe half true but confusing in the prior tradition, are going to come fully to light in the in respect, in retrospect, let's say, after the cross. And I think this is the blank check that Jesus writes on the road to Emmaus, when he opens the scriptures, all the Hebrew scriptures, for his disciples, and shows that they were always pointing to him. This kind of gesture applies in a lot of Christian thought to all of reality, all of life. And this is, for instance, one reason why Dante doesn't put the great Greek philosophers in hell. He's puts them right at the edge, right? Precisely because he thinks that even though they didn't have salvation, even though they didn't have knowledge of Christ, nevertheless, they had their faces up against the glass, right? That everything that could be seen this side of the incarnation, they had seen. And there are many points at which, in their height, at their height, these two traditions actually echo one another in these really beautiful and mysterious ways. I mean, one example in the book that I bring up is this very Greek Aristotelian idea called hylomorphism, which is from the idea of combining form and matter, that these things, that spirit and flesh, or form and matter, aren't totally distinct. They actually are threaded through one another. And this is not, again, this idea doesn't kind of drop out of the sky. Not everybody thinks this way. Not even Plato seems to really think this way. And Aristotle comes up very carefully with this idea. And yet it's really beautifully reflected in the book of Genesis, when God breathes his breath of life into the dust to create man, Adam. It's neither the disembodied breath nor the dirt that makes a living soul. The nefesh chayim in Hebrew, the living being, is this fusion of sort of spirit and dust. And so when somebody like Thomas Aquinas comes along, and people sometimes accuse Aquinas of kind of shoehorning Aristotle into the Christian tradition by sheer force of will, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think there's a real isomorphism, real consonance with the best that Jerusalem has to offer and the best that Athens has to offer, which is what you would expect if both cultures, both civilizations, were approaching truths that are universal, even if they look very different from different perspectives.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Especially the reconciliation, even in the 16th and the 15th and 16th centuries, when this whole treasure trove of Greek knowledge was rediscovered in the Renaissance,
Sure.
especially Aristotle, because um, a lot of his works were lost. They weren't really translated by monks and monasteries, and it is only through Arabic translations of Aristotle that a lot of his works were rediscovered, and that just shook the Platonic consensus in the
Mm.
Renaissance, and thought and people kept thinking about how to what actually is true if these two philosophers disagree on so many different ways, and how does Christianity fit into the picture. um Next, I wanted to move on to the body crisis.
Mm.
Um, you mentioned this one term, soul dysphoria, in the book. That itself is a very fascinating term. Could you just explain what you mean by it, and what is the role for the soul in today's world?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe let's start here. I present in the book an argument that people who are materialists about the human person, people that think we're just flesh, we're just atoms, we're just, you know, various arrangements, heaps of chemical and muscle and bone, um, kind of get it exactly backwards. Usually, these arguments, like I cite Noah Yuval Harari as one example of this, that kind of try to derive all of human experience out of merely mechanical physical processes. Um, they usually end up with this sort of remainder. It's like a kind of gaseous extra that is left over after they've performed all their calculations. And they say, well, there's consciousness, right? There's sort of this qualitative experience that we have of the world. And Harari at one point in I think it's in Homo Deus, although maybe in Sapiens, it's somewhere he says, why the hell do we need to feel these feelings, given that our body as a machine works perfectly well and we could just automatically retreat from dangerous things without also having what we experience when we have the rush of adrenaline. And even talking about it that way, a rush of adrenaline doesn't get at what we're actually talking about. There's this kind of irreducible extra bit left over. And my suggestion is that extra bit, that qualitative experience, that's what we should be starting from, because we all know that's there. We can't factor it out. We can never quite, distill it away or drain it out of our account of ourselves. And that's because it's actually the whole point of us is to love, to desire, to have memories, dreams, these sensations, these whole kind of qualitative experience of the world. That's what is a human being in some fundamental sense. And so really the question is not why the heck does that happen? It's given that that is what we are, why the heck do we have bodies? Why is it that we have to kind of grow old and die? Why is it that we can be vulnerable to physical pain? And that is really the more fundamental question that's at stake whenever people start talking about, they want to edit their genes or they want to perform surgery upon themselves to conform to a different sex or gender, what have you, is really this notion that what we are is kind of the divine spark, kind of an emanation, a gender identity, whatever you want to call it. And this flesh is a burden or at best a plaything, right? And so this is, when I talk about soul dysphoria, what I'm saying is that basically our refusal to acknowledge that we have souls is kind of what is really going on under the surface of all this talk about our body dysphoria, our gender dysphoria, whatever. Really, it's a kind of sense that something about us isn't fully answered by our flesh. And I would say that's true, but there are actually saner ways from the tradition of dealing with this problem. That's where that concept of hylomorphism comes in really handy, is, every attempt, either ancient or modern, to treat the body as a kind of burden or extra or a mistake, it always ends us up feeling dissatisfied and in the worst possible case, mutilated and depressed. The real way to understand ourselves is as embodied souls. Your body is not a mistake. Your soul is not an illusion. The two are intimately related. Your body is the language in which the soul expresses itself in the material world. And once you grasp that, a whole lot of other things start to make sense, but you kind of have to plunk for the soul, which is simply an irreducible fact about our even having this conversation at all. We don't just have a series of experiences. We have this, unified consciousness. And when you talk about the soul, sometimes people think, oh, you're talking about like a fancy ghost, or you're talking about like a, magic fairy dust being. But actually, I'm just talking about a philosophical necessity that's implied in talking about human beings at all in any way that recognizes what they are. It's just the fact of our having a consciousness.
This actually reminds me of a very important concept in economics,
Hmm.
developed by Robert Lucas, who still is associated with the University of Chicago, a very influential economist. And his main criticism of the Keynesian economic consensus is that you cannot just use um, data points and empiricism to especially data from the past, to predict what's going to happen in the future, to formulate policies. You need an overall theoretical construct. You need an underlying intuition which helps guide these questions. And I think that's very valid to what's happening here with the soul. You need a soul. You need to have like feelings like love or you talk about this later on in the book. You need to have this is all not just little sparks of chemical reactions. That does not tell the full story. And later when you talk about this um, another conflict between religion and science, um, science, you say, tries to answer questions which were never really intended to be answered by specific studies in science, by that deductive method, by that method of investigation. That's where religion comes in. They are much more so complements than opposites. And I think various scientists across history who were in themselves devoutly religious understood this, whether it is Newton or Galileo or anyone else. Um, that brings me to the next part of the book when you're talking about the crisis of meaning. Um, can we go a bit deeper into that crisis, especially as it pertains to art and culture and music? Um, I remember one excerpt from your father, Andrew Klavan, no relation, his show.
No, no,
Um,
never heard of him, but right, go on.
Absolutely. He talks about when he was growing up listening to Frank Sinatra, there was this real meaning and profound depth to the lyrics of Sinatra's songs
Hmm.
and music, and for many of his contemporary singers as well. Um, Later come the Beatles, bands and other bands in the 80s, 90s, and of course now 2000, you have this just this burst of music like rap, or the example you take up here, Cardi B's WAP.
Hmm.
Um, as a music major, it is a bit upsetting for me to see where music has gotten to a place where it just has no real depth to the words. The words do not really appeal to your soul or to your heart or to even your imagination or mind. Um, how did this happen? What has the crisis of meaning to do with it?
Well, all of that is so well said. There's so much that's important in what you've just said, beginning with the economic observation that all of our data points are already theory laden in a certain way. I think also of Karl Popper and some of the other theorists of science in the 20th century who have reckoned with this fact. And by the way, 17th, 18th century scientists, philosophers of science, people like Newton, Boyle, even Bacon to a certain extent, but to a greater extent, the members of the Royal Society who followed after Bacon were acutely aware of this problem and were, on the one hand, excited about the possibility of empirical observation, but on the other hand, constantly grappling with the need for hypothesis in the original Greek sense, which is a kind of network of assumptions that frames your observations, because otherwise you don't know what to look for, you don't know what you're looking at, and you don't know how to interpret what you're looking at. This is all kind of built into the structure even of scientific experiment. And what this really cashes out in terms of is this promise that we have, this kind of simplistic idea that science or political science or economics, or pick your discipline of choice, this idea that that's going to give you a quote unquote objective, which is to say third person God's eye view of reality that has no kind of consciousness overlaying it. That's really an illusion. There is no such thing as that. And one thing that quantum physicists are grappling with right now is the pure extent to which all of our observations, even the rawest possible sense data, or the most distant, mechanical registration of a machine, all of those observations are already threaded through with what, Kant would have identified as kind of our a priori concepts, I think, and this is by design, because actually that's kind of what reality is. The reality isn't just like lumps of inert stuff and then fictions that we impose upon it with our minds. Reality is a relationship between the outside world and the consciousness. All of this is urgently important in art, because art is the way in which, in some sense, we kind of embody that qualitative human engagement that we have with the world, the way we have of communicating everything that's true about the world that is not purely quantitative, that doesn't boil down to what Galileo would have, I think, fallaciously identified as primary qualities, right? And this is why a misunderstanding of this is, I think, why art becomes worse and worse as the years go on. Last time you and I talked, it was at the YAF event over at where you are, University of Chicago. And we talked a little bit about abstract art, atonal music, and the fact that I really believe these things are contradictions in terms, that taking away structure or attempting to evade structure just gets you basically into more and more simplistic and purposefully ugly structures. It doesn't actually accomplish the goal, which is to escape structure altogether, or to achieve some kind of, rule-free, boundary-free concept of space or communication. So given that that's true, right, the thing that I said then remains my position, that our task, the generations to come in art and in literature and in philosophy, that all of us will be tasked with not breaking the forms down further, but finding forms that accurately express the realities of today. I mean, this is why Sinatra is great and Cardi B kind of sucks, is that like transgression only works if you're talking about a world that is threaded through with form and order to begin with. And then, yeah, there's some meaning to breaking the rules, but there's no meaning to a world without any rules at all, just as there's no content to an observation that comes without form.
Absolutely. And just going back to what we talked about, this idea of everything having an underlying form, I think that's very evident in at the turn of the 17th century in particular, and I shall never hesitate to cite my favorite composer, Claude.
No, I knew he would come up. We should have a drinking game. Every time you say Verdi, is it going to be Verdi or
Monteverdi this time.
Monteverdi? Excuse me, I always get that wrong. Monteverdi. Go
Um,
on.
yeah, I'm known for excessive citations of Monteverdi and Machiavelli in more recent times among my friends. Um, the way he develops the second practice, it's completely radical at his time. It's a complete transgression from the musical ideals proposed by theorists like, say, Giuseppe Zarlino at the end of the 16th century. And this new composer, this young upstart, comes up and says, no, I am going to use certain dissonances and certain really harsh clashes when they're necessary, but there is an underlying form and meaning to it. Monteverdi's whole justification for this new radical style of music is the text. The text, he says, is supposed to be the mistress of the music and not the other way around. compare that with atonality, and I just do not think there is an underlying rationale or underlying meaning to completely distort musical structure in ways which would have made the ancient Greeks, the Pythagoreans, and even people like Boethius just gasp and clutch at their pearls. Um, but just to move on to the crisis of religion, I feel like we touched a lot upon that, but I definitely wanted to bring up the new religion of today, science, the way science has become a religion, the way people, especially during the COVID crisis, have held up the science as this untouchable ideal, this thing which just has to be true, and any study, any data set, even empirically produced evidence suggesting otherwise must be tossed out the window. How did we come to that, and how do we address it?
Well, I think it's a very predictable result of the attempt to boil everything down to physical interactions, matter, atoms bouncing off of one another. Because for all the reasons that we've been saying, there is always going to be more to human life and interactions than that. That is always going to be important. Our existence in physical space is always going to matter very much, but there's always also going to be something that's communicated through that existence, which can't be reduced to an equation or a brain scan or a measurement of hormonal levels or whatever. And given that that's true, any attempt to exclude all religious questions from the world is really just going to be an attempt to answer religious questions by other means, because those questions are going to be there. And so any discipline that tries to become totalizing, that tries to give a totalizing account of human life, is going to end up looking a lot like a religion, because people don't just wake up in the morning and ask, how can I optimize my cortisol levels today? They actually wake up and say, how can I find purpose? How can I do good? How can I seek justice, love mercy? And those sorts of questions aren't well answered by statistics, by equations. They all of those things can aid us in that quest, but you're going to ultimately end up making some metaphysical religious claims. And I think this is why, not for nothing, the Bible has this line, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And for a long time, I used to read that line, and I think other people read this way too. I used to read that line and think, oh, this just means atheists are dumb. Like, this just means it's sort of stupid to be an atheist, right? And fair enough, whatever. It's fine if that's what the Bible is saying, but I actually don't think that's what the Bible is saying. I think it's saying something a little bit deeper than that, which is, if you tell yourself that you have no God, that you have no religion, that you have no worship, that there's no highest good in your life, if you tell yourself that, you are making yourself into a fool. You're kidding yourself. It's a kind of self-deception. And that's because everybody wakes up in the morning with an objective in mind, even if it's just to go get a cup of coffee. Well, you ask, why do you want the cup of coffee? Because I need to be alert for my job. Why do you want your job? Well, so I can get money. Well, what do you want the money for? So that I can spend more time with my family, so that I can go to more movies, whatever, right? Somewhere there is a final answer to what is good. And the good is not a material thing. The good is a transcendent thing. It is an objective toward which we orient ourselves. And once you start talking that way, you are basically doing worship. You might not be calling it that, but that's what you're doing. And so the whole argument of the crisis of religion section is just, why not become self-aware? Why not realize that you are always going to be worshiping, and ask, what's worthy of worship? What deserves that position in your life? Because, spoiler alert, it's not Dr. Fauci. Even if he presents the science, or is the science, or is its priest, or whatever, he's going to ultimately disappoint you, just like all the other gods of this world, is how the Bible would put it. Just like the WEF and the CDC, nothing deserves to be in that place except for the good in itself, and goodness personified, which is God.
Absolutely. And that's just what I think is a symptom of a larger problem, as you said, with people trying to substitute other things for God, like the French Revolution, for example, trying to substitute God out with the state. And we all know how that ended in the long term. Um,
It was great, wasn't it? I didn't reach the end of that book. Did that went fine, right? That was totally fine.
yeah, completely fine.
Yeah,
It's not
no
like
problems with that.
thousands of people aren't getting guillotined or anything. You don't have to worry
No,
about
no,
that.
no. Well, that's a really interesting, actually, in seriousness, since we do know that ended in massacre and terror. That's a really interesting example of you can actually watch the language of the divine slip out of the language of rights if you read, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Gradually over time, people stop talking as if these rights were endowed, as if they existed in some absolute space. They're simply things that we all owe to one another. You get more talk about desert, right? Or dignity, which is from a Latin word meaning basically things you deserve. But a lot of our language stops making any sense when we do that. For instance, all men are brothers, right? Brothers and sisters. There's a family of the human race. Well, what reason do we have for believing that unless we believe that we have a common parent, that there is some absolute sense in which we all spring from the same source? Because in point of fact, it's certainly not true at a material level, right? So a lot of these rights claims, even that we want to make, rely on metaphysical claims and cease to make any sense or to have any evidence in their favor once we take God out of the picture, which, as you say, is usually a recipe for bad stuff to happen.
Exactly. And I think that's where economic liberty and social liberty are just so jointly correlated that economics as a discipline, and I say this as an economist in training, is
Mm,
not the end all be all of the world. It's not
mm,
as any other such discipline. It's you're always using these to aspire to a higher goal, right? To self-actualization. And to that end, liberty, whether it's in the economic form or the social cultural form, and liberty again, not just as a means to just do whatever the heck you want to do, um, is important in achieving that end. In recent years, Arthur Brooks, who is the former president of the American Enterprise Institute, in 2015, he came out with his book, The Conservative Heart.
mm.
And in that, he really talks a lot about this, that conservatives, feels have the right policies, have the right economic policies, are happier as people, give more to charity. Why is it then that conservatives are not so good at winning elections? That's just more and more true in recent years. Um, that entire book talks about this, all these disciplines an as a means to this higher end of the pursuit of happiness, as is written in the Declaration of Independence. um, but finally, moving on to the crisis of regime, uh,
Mm,
I wanted to talk more about Marxism.
yeah.
Um, and you do a great job of explaining in the book how Marxism, in its original formulation, is this class conflict. It's the workers versus the bourgeoisie. How, over the last century or so, would you say, has that translated into cultural and social Marxism?
Right. Well, this is a funny place where punditry, right-wing pundits who shake their fingers about cultural Marxism, it's very easy to make fun of them, and people on the left often do, and they say, "What this has nothing to do with Marxism. This is like a whole separate issue." And it's what's funny is, actually the right-wing pundits in their way are, I think, more correct, because one of the things that I talk about in the book is, Marxism in its original formulation is, of course, a theory of economic class conflict. But that theory, in turn, is founded on a metaphysics, and it's quite expressly founded on an engagement, with Hegel and with this whole set of questions about man's material situation, the nature of man, right? Mankind. How does man define himself as the creature that works for a living, or what? Um, and one thing that turns out to be the case is the economic analysis can actually be lifted pretty easily off of the metaphysics, and the metaphysics can remain. It's a It's a metaphysics. It's not even really a metaphysics, since there is no meta, there is no beyond. There's just a kind of material analysis of, boiling down everything to material interests. And that project, when it failed as an economic cell in the States, was quite expressly reworked and repurposed into a social struggle, into class conflict between different aggrieved groups, women, different races, different sexualities, right? I mean, this is where, for instance, we get our term white privilege. I mean, that not everybody knows this, but this has a specific history among kind of Marxist groups in the States. That can the white workers be radicalized was a question that was always being asked, because they have white skin privilege. They don't see their own, their own sort of oppressiveness and so forth. And so these concepts, which are basically just a little, it's like changing the key. It's like taking something that was written in the key of economics and transposing it into the key of social strife, right? These concepts are avowedly Marxist, historically Marxist in their sort of intellectual descent. And they also share a fundamentally Marxist gesture, which is the accusation that what you're saying is not actually based on your vision of the truth, your ideas about what's true, but your implicit, often your unacknowledged or sort of unaware desire to retain power, to continue in the power structures that benefit you. Now, of course, all these kinds of analysis never turn back on the person doing the analysis himself. So, Marx never subjects himself to this same kind of critique that maybe he's just a Marxist because, or he just believes what he believes because of his power position or what have you. But even leaving that aside, right, it really is the case that in America, what we are facing, one of our big movements that's often called wokeness or whatever, is really a very radical form of cultural Marxism. And whatever else that is, it is fundamentally antithetical to the American idea, which is based on, as you've now articulated quite nicely, individual rights, individual liberty, and also this kind of communal sense of social contract that bounds that liberty within order. All of those things depend on a good faith belief that you and I, when we talk to one another, are not actually first and foremost engaging as people of a certain racial class or sexuality or gender or whatever, but as human beings, right, in the sight of their creator, who are created equal qua human beings, and are therefore capable of rational dialogue and discussion. And if there's anything that we need to sort of save our politics, it's the reaffirmation that first and foremost, before anything else, as neighbors, as members of political communities, we are Americans. We may have all these other things that inform us. We may have life experiences that differ, but fundamentally, we are Americans. And that's what creates that politicae filia that we were talking about at the beginning, that political friendship that binds communities together. It's why I spend so much time talking about Marxism in the book, even though I know it's kind of a pundity buzzword. I actually think this is one point on which the pundits have it right, and it's important.
That's absolutely right. And now I see that we are almost out of time. And just as my final question, I wanted to ask you to pitch this book to someone who hasn't read it. Why should they read it? And what is the main lesson they can take from it, and how they can apply it in life today, in everyday life?
Oh, thank you for inviting me to do that. It's one of my favorite things to do. This is a book based on the radical idea that the past has something to say to the present. We have, all of us, you and me, grown up in a culture, in a cultural cloud of accusations against the past, that the past is backwards, that it's superstitious, that especially quote unquote Western ideas and values are inherently oppressive and need to be rejected. What a fundamentally lonely and arrogant way to live your life. I mean, never mind that it's highly improbable that all the good answers would have been thought up in the last 5 minutes. And it's also just really sorrowful and sad for me to imagine people out there facing the problems that we're facing and feeling like the only people that can guide us, them, the world, the only people that can give us any answers are the people currently alive on the earth. Because I look around, I don't know about you, I see the people that are offering answers, and I don't get a lot of satisfaction out of like Harari and Schwab and Biden and, even Trump, whatever, whoever you vote for. Like, these guys are some of them may be good, some of them may be bad, but they don't actually have a lot of rich fare, rich food to offer us. And the great secret, the joy, is that actually there is an enormous storehouse, treasure house available to us right now on the internet. So many of these things are free. And this book is a way into that treasure house. It is a book to let you know that you're not alone. You don't have to face the challenges of the world just on your own meager intellectual resources. You can, as Machiavelli says, you can enter the ancient courts of ancient men, and they actually have something to say to the present. Being surrounded by books, being surrounded in a tradition, means being surrounded with friends. And if there's anything that we need for the days ahead, it's going to be friends.
Spencer Klavan, thank you so much for joining me for this interview.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Aatman.